Welcome everyone. My name is Jeremy Dorzier and I'm the founder of Cartier Developments. We are here. We have the pleasure, honestly, to welcome you guys to this new webinar. This webinar, we're going to try to discuss about the importance of the quality processes within the valuation of medical device startups. I'm here with Hein Smith-Sibinga. Hein is a director of quality. He has a pretty extensive expertise into the medical device and pharmaceutical organization. He's been involved in system engineering, clinical effort, product management, been working with Fortune 500 for on the buying side of the valuation of the M&A valuation, and most recently with startups on the selling side of this M&A valuation. So that's an expert. Welcome, Hein, to this webinar. Very, very happy to have you on board.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. It is indeed an exciting topic where I've learned many hard lessons over the years, working with various startup organizations in the med device and biotech space, getting them oftentimes successfully acquired, sometimes not so successfully. There's a lot of learning lessons to be had from that.
I'm very, very excited to dive into the topic, because that's a very, very important topic. Oftentimes we hear so many times that we have startups that basically have maybe the wrong mindset and the wrong thinkings in terms of how the valuation of their companies is being processed. So I'm very happy that you are able here to share your feedback and your expertise on that specific topic. I'm sure we're going to help a lot of startup companies.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, what I've learned is that many entrepreneurs tend to focus on the market position, the science, but they underestimate the value that good, simple, pragmatic documentation brings, and the investment into your quality system really adds enormously to the value. And once you start understanding how your strategic acquirers look at you as part of your M&A process, it becomes apparent that quality is an essential driver in the overall value of the company. And we'll go through some of the details in that.
I'm very excited to start. So what's can you share a little bit more information about the type of agenda that you're planning to cover today?
Sure, absolutely. So I think it'd be good to first understand a little bit more detail exactly how we in quality actually end up adding value to the overall organization. It's not just about defending yourself against potential audit findings or the FDA or anything like that, but you have a direct value, because the most critical reviewers really are the technical resources over at the acquiring company, who are going to make a risk evaluation based upon the documentation in front of them. But once you understand that then a little bit, and you have understood the impact of all of that, then we'll go into the second half of this session, where we'll I'll present a tool that you can use and that you can develop, and that's really time tested, where we're taking the best practices out of design controls, phase-gated product development, and apply that to the entire enterprise, from inception to market or inception to acquisition, and understanding how that applies to your company, how to apply the thought patterns and make it fit the needs of your individual situation, so you can derive maximum value out of this and not lose out on really a substantial chunk of your valuation. That should really help a lot. It's I think really a very, very different way of getting motivated about doing things right.
Yeah, I'm very excited to learn, because like, yeah, to get like more feedback again on how the quality, you know, impact the valuation. So yeah, I let you start into like the first part, which is what you're going to explain, right?
Sure, yeah. Let's delve right back, right in. So, and there are many studies around this from in the Harvard Business Journal and other places, right? But the value of your quality strategy really adds to your evaluation. And here's how, right? So really, let's step back a little bit and think about, okay, as quality regulatory professional, what am I interested in? Well, I'm always interested, of course, in driving a safe, reliable, and effective and compliant product, right? There's no question about it. And what we've always learned is to think as quality professionals in a conformance-driven perspective, right? We worry about what the auditors might see. We worry about what goes into the regulatory submission, right? And we worry about complaint handling, right? How may things go wrong and what happens, right? And just in case an auditor finds something wrong and we get a warning letter, oh my God, then that is going to give a lot of negative effect on the company. But it is all long term, and there's a chance you roll the dice. It may happen or it may not. Now, sometimes it goes horrifically wrong. Yeah, I get it. I've been there, right? But that is the traditional way of thinking, right? And so therefore, we are telling people, well, you have to do things right and you have to document things the right way, because if the big bad auditor comes around, right, then things are going to go be really, really bad for us. But there's another thing that we need to consider, and really that is the M&A value-driven perspective of quality, right? And that comes down to, what are investors and acquiring companies and their due diligence teams looking for? But how do they look at your design history file and your quality management system, right? And really make a risk-based decision as to, okay, how much are we going to discount the total potential value of this organization based upon the professionality and the clarity of the quality system and all the technical documentation, right? So if you start thinking about it from that perspective, that's a very, very different story, right? And that really starts driving a story that says, okay, how do we add value? Why should we invest into quality? Well, right. If you step back, and certainly in medical device and biotech, this is really very, very much true. There are three major axes along which valuation is established, right? Of course, very important, how much market access, what is the potential to the acquiring company to realize sales and profit in the short to near term, in the next couple of years, right? It's an important factor in establishing values. Can you access all the markets that the acquiring company needs to do, even if you yourself would not have adequate resources to do? Of course, science and your patent position is a critical factor in all of this as well. Very, very important. But the third point, as I have been saying, is your technical documentation, your QMS, your design history file, all of that. So let's take an example, right? If we think about a startup company, right, that is to be acquired, and let's say, for argument's sake, for ease of math, that we're taking a startup company that's roughly worth $100 million. Now, there's many companies that are in that kind of sort of size, right? You might be in one of them. So what you will then start seeing is that if you break this down very roughly, then your market access and potential, depending on your technology, is going to be somewhere worth 30 to 60% of your overall value. Let's call it a third, right? So that makes it 34 million out of that 100 million. Your science and IP position, of course, is critical, right? This is what you're based upon. This is what you started with. Well, that's not a roughly third, typically 20 to 50%, depending on the strength, right? But then your technical documentation is equally important. It's also roughly a third, by 20 to 40%. of the value. It can drop significantly if you don't do it right. So that's how a acquiring company kind of breaks that down, right? Now, in the US, it's very, very typical that a mid to upper level manager, director, vice president, somebody like me, and you probably as well, has stock options. And those stock options tend to be worth between 1/4 and 0.5%. Sometimes you're lucky and you have more, right, of the total asset value. So what that means is that at the time of sale, right, your stock options are going to be worth 0.5% of that 100 million, which is $500,000. And you can see how that then breaks down into equal thirds, right? Now, this is an important motivator, right? Because, well, hold on, wait a minute. Are we really saying here that 2-3 years from now, when we sell the company, my contribution to doing good documentation, clear documentation, is worth $165,000 to my bonus, or 33 million to the entire company? Yes, it is that much, right? So that's a different way, right? There's a positive upside instead of a negative downside for auditing. Now, that's seemingly logical math, right? So let me take an example out of my recent career where something like that happened. I've anonymized it a little bit, right? But I was with a startup company in the past couple of years, right? And I joined that startup company, and they had already made the decision that it wasn't going to be a US strategy, sales strategy only, because we would not have the resources to sell in Europe. But because that decision was made, the company also decided that we would not need 13485 or CE marking, right? Now, we all know that 13485 and CE marking takes a long, long time. It takes the CE marking takes 2-3 years nowadays, right? So what ended up happening here, right? Well, if we set the overall value of the company back to the same 100 million, right? We got hit for by not being able to access Europe in the near term, the next 3-4 years, right? We got penalized on the market access, right? Now my market access is not Europe plus US anymore, not the global market, but US only, right? So a penalty was applied of roughly 40% onto the market access. So down we go, right? The science and IP position, of course, haven't changed, right? But my technical documentation, because I didn't pursue, or the company ended up pursuing 13485 or CE marking in time, right, also got dinged, right? Because by not having 13485 and by not having a path in the near term towards CE marking, right, the acquiring company says that is a lot of risk that we now have to assume, right? And we have to somehow make that up, right? So between those factors, we lost in value roughly $30 million, right? And it all stemmed from this one simple decision of not doing 13485 for CE marking, right? And, my bonus potential with that also went down, right, by $150,000. Well, that is, right, also a good motivator to put people. But now it's interesting because typically, right, implementing a full QMS between, having a good director of quality and other people, right, that takes roughly $1 million, $1.5 million, right? But you can see how that in this case affected, but resulted in a $30 million value, right? So it's actually quite cheap money to invest in your quality system and to put the resources in and to do it right, right? As if I were a CEO, I would say, well, if I can get a 30x amplifier on my investment, I would definitely do that.
Yeah, especially that's the cost to just pursue that European certification once you already do like most of the work for the North American and American one could be marginal compared to the upsell that you can get.
Indeed, yeah. So, but this is one of the reasons why it is so valuable, right? doing it right. So it's of course only one example of a case, right? And it's not just about the 13485. There can be other reasons in manufacturing, in your design history file, everywhere to do this right. So really what is important is that we understand who are we writing our documentation for? Who is actually using it, right? At the end of the day, let's be very frank, right? If I look at technical documentation, my engineers, my mechanical engineers are going to go into SolidWorks and look at the CAD model, right? My software engineers are going to look at the code, right? My electrical engineers will look at the electrical schematics, right? They're not as much looking in the details of the technical documentation. Who really reads it, right? Well, we've always been taught, well, it's the regulatory agencies and the notified bodies. Absolutely, right? And the auditors really will look at it. Well, that's true too. But more importantly, the diligence teams for the investors and acquirers are really my toughest customers. They read these things the closest. They have the most time and the most at stake in their review, right? And understanding that means that you need to understand how that documentation then gets used. And you need to divvy it up properly so that you can chunk it out. You don't want to give too much information all at once, right? So go and understand how data rooms are used, right? The interface between the company when you're at the various stages of acquisition, from superficial information, first blush, to very, very detailed information, right? How do you get information on and forth? Which documents out of your documentation need to go into the data room? How is it redacted? And what's the technology there? How do you make that easy, right? Structuring your documentation to meet the needs, right? The more advanced people amongst us have learned to understand that you want to structure your documentation such that you can copy and paste from your technical documentation to your 510K and into your technical documentation for the notified body, right? You want to minimize repeating information and have many smaller documents rather than large ones, and use a language, right? A language that is less scientific but easier to understand by general business people, because they are the ones that are actually trying to assess what the value is. And if they feel that you're trying to bamboozle them, right, then they don't feel so good about it. The example I used was, of course, about a decision on 13485. I've had many examples in many, many other areas across the company, different ones, right? But I think the case is clear here, right? Really what it comes down to is we need to identify what potential issues there are across the companies, not underinvest in one area, but not overinvest either. You don't want to be over-prepared in one area of the company and under-prepared in another. Have too much marketing too early or not enough early enough, right? Similar with quality in other areas. Right. So we need to create value across the company in all departments of the company at a compatible pace. How do we do that? How do we measure that? Right. And we need to understand the needs of all the stakeholders of the quality system. And as you've just seen, that is not just the auditor, it's not just the notified bodies and the regulators, but much more importantly, it's the investors and the acquiring companies, their diligence teams.
So how do we do to go with that? What's the different steps?
Well, that's a very good question, right? And here's where we can borrow a lot of examples from design controls and other principles to help the company organize and essentially break down the maturity of the organization into a series of stage gates, if you would, like we have, right? But we're going to need to broaden our thinking, right? So stage gating, as quality professionals, we've all seen it over and over and over again, but we're going to need to broaden that out and think about the entire organization rather than just product development and manufacturing. So how do we actually do that, right? What could you do? Well, let's step back, right? what are we used to in stage-gated product development? Well, right, there are early phases where we're just doing scientific development, right? Everything before we as quality get involved doesn't matter. It's unregulated. We don't really worry about it. Then we start getting involved in design controls, right? Feasibility phase and proving out that the technology can actually be done. Then we do planning and requirements writing and defining what the product is and defining the strategy in phase one. Right? Then you go into detailed design and development and system integration and all those kinds of good things, leading into verification and transfer to manufacturing. Then, of course, we have a long phase of regulatory and launch, right? In medical device, that takes a year and a half. And then you get into surveillance once you get into the market. But all of this under design controls is heavily product focused, right? It's about engineering, it's about science, it's about manufacturing. Clinical, we'll think a little bit about QA and RA. But we don't really consider typically the other departments. What should finance be doing? How should this be affected by our rounds of investment? No, those are all things that are magically happen at the C-suite level. We don't really think about it. Right? So it's product strategy that we're worried about in the phase gating, not business strategy. But what if we were to do that? Right? What if we were to understand how to break down the life of the company and look at the company as a whole as essentially an entire product? After all, that's what we're selling at, isn't it? So it's interesting because there are frameworks out there, and the most well-documented one is comes out of the Department of Defense and NASA together with the NIH.
Yeah.
And they have for years and years and years, and it's very common in aerospace and of course NASA, but a number of governments around the world use this model where they have broken down the maturity of the organization into roughly 9 phases. I've mapped out the design controls phases that we as quality professionals are so used to. And you can see that for the early stages, we're not covering them, right? But then it starts to align, right? Now, this NASA framework, again, is product focused, it's science focused, right? So the next thing that we then do is we start saying, what are we not covering? What other departments do we need to think about? Well, right? So if we start mapping that out, now we can start building a matrix. And of course, R&D and development, right? Whereas product development across all these stages. Yes, we're worried about that. Clinical and clinical trials, manufacturing, right? Okay, the things in white we're used to seeing, right? That is our normal bread and butter here. But what if we were to also map out what the deliverables by each stage of maturity should be for marketing and sales, for business strategy, funding and M&A, business operations, HR, legal, right? And you can go on like that. You can break it down whichever way you want. You want to start mapping this out on an enterprise wide scale. And that's really important because now as an organization, you can start agreeing what it means to be in lockstep with each other. How mature does everybody needs to be at the same time? So if you do this, right, and that is going to take several weeks worth of work, it's not easy. I never said it was going to be easy. You may end up with a matrix that starts looking like this, right? And the exact text of all of this doesn't really matter all that much. You will define this for your own, where everybody should be at. The point here is that across a stage gate, right, at each column here, we know where the company should be at. Right? In this example, we're somewhere at that TRL level 6 is where the company last was when I looked at them, right? And you can start seeing in a very simple model where the company was ahead or behind where that was, right? And obviously, in this specific case, the zones in red ended up being a bit of a problem to the startup organization. We hadn't planned that appropriately. And that came all the way back to an earlier thing that happened up on the top row here in the middle, on the tier where you see an area in yellow where we had not defined the business strategy adequately, not understood it in enough detail. And with that, we ended up falling behind and not understanding the product well enough for what we needed to do, right? So the point here is that if you do this, right, and if you apply a rigorous set of well-defined, clear deliverables, phase by phase by phase, then this starts to happen. There are companies that do this, right, in various ways and shapes. Right? I first learned this approach not with this table, but looking at it enterprise-wide when I was at Roche Diagnostics. Right? This is a further evolution of that and actually brings it to a very simple dashboard that really starts telling you how ready you are at any given point of time.
Yeah, we can clearly see here as well that it's really important always like to, get your science right as well before advancing the different phases within like the product development life cycle as well.
Yes, yeah, and looking at it from that perspective, right? It's bringing in well-defined systems, right? These are not complex systems. This is an agreement, right? And an understanding where the entire business needs to be. So now we can help each other, right? Because I understand now from this, right? And of course, behind this sits much more detail, what everybody needs to be able to do, right? And maybe at a certain point of time, I can understand, well, I should be investing into a ALM system early on. And maybe I can wait with an ERP system. Maybe marketing needs something earlier on, right? Or we need to understand better what the reimbursement scheme needs to be so we can set up the reimbursement codes. Right? And I've seen companies go wrong there as well, right? Because we didn't understand how reimbursement was going to work. And so we had a great product, passed clinical trials, we couldn't sell it because the insurance companies wouldn't reimburse. So you need to understand that. And that is in itself a multi-year process, right? So you got to map all the way to the end, understand how all these factors work, and map that out like this. Right. And of course, behind a dashboard like this, you break this down into more and more detail, right? And then it actually all becomes very, very doable.
Do you have any recommendation on at what point in time within like the product development lifecycle do you advise companies to invest in those systems that help them to get like a more organized information toward like with always like the objective of getting like higher valuation for the acquisition? At what point in time it is important to invest in an LM, QMS, or other tools like that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. In general, right, if you look at it from a regulatory perspective, right, and a traditional quality regulatory perspective, you start investing in that direction around the time that you start really the nitty-gritty design and development, right? You've proven that the technology works, you've shown that the technology can be translated into a manufacturable product, right? And now you start a detailed design, right? So around that phase gate 0. Problem is that if you start thinking about it around that time, you have not budgeted for it. So you need to think about it much earlier, right? So really, if I go back one slide, right, it is around the time that I start saying, okay, I have a viable technology, the IP is there, I can start translating it. That is the time that I would start thinking about this roadmap, right? Now, does that mean that I need to have a quality director at that point of time? No, I don't think so, right? That comes a little bit later, right? Right around the time that I start really defining the product. But I do need to know and understand what the deliverables are. I need to know how much is it going to take? How long is it going to take, right? How much effort is there? And if I need to be ready for something in a year and a half from now, and right, for instance, 13485, yeah, that takes a year to a year and a half to get from nothing to a certificate, right? So if I need to be have that ready before I start design verification validation or to have the business strategy work, I may have to have that in place a little bit earlier, right? And that depends on the complexity of the product, the nature of the product, the development cycle of the product. So it depends a little bit.
And I have another question as well. Like, I wonder if you can share your feedback and maybe advice to other founder on what is important, what's like Fortune 500 that want to acquire a medical device startups will look at, and what is really important to make sure that we respect or we try to follow early on in order to try to mitigate those potential issues. Do you have any recommendation to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, there are variations by market segment, right? In general, in medical device, we're still in a place where you have to prepare your company as though you're going onto market, right? So it's very important that you understand that the big companies, and there's only so many of them, right? So your potential large acquiring companies typically, is a handful or so. They all talk to each other. They all know each other, right? They know who they're talking to, right? If you're down to one or two potential acquirers, right, you better have an approach to get onto market yourself and be able to sustain yourself a few years. Otherwise, they're just gonna string you along and wait for you to run out of money. Happens all the time. The number of times where there's a magical investor, like we all tend to think that we're going to get, that actually happens, is actually very, very rare, right? So you need to be preparing yourself as though you go onto market as a medical device. Sit right around the time that you get your regulatory clearances in place, right? Sometimes a little bit later, sometimes a little bit earlier, but they're going to wait you out. In biotech, it's a little bit different. That's really just prior to your phase 3 clinical trial that happens, right? So it's a different risk profile that they take. And then, of course, then the variations depend on where in the medical device market you sit. So these are all key factors. I know there's a lot of variation there, and that is why you need to do the homework yourself. I wouldn't tell you, well, take the table I put in front of you, take it verbatim, understand it, and apply it. That's not going to work. You're going to have to understand it yourself. You're going to have to build it yourself. Go through the exercise. And then make sure that you have the right technologies in place at the right time, right? Make sure you have a good ALM system, right? Your requirements management, your risk management, your V&V testing. Have a good system for that. Have a good electronic QMS. You cannot do this without a good quality QMS. And then by the time you're midway through your development, you're going to need a decent BOM management system on top of that. So how are you going to do that, right? Are you going to buy multiple systems, or are you going to go with one of the few that can actually do all of them decently? Right? Is your manufacturing strategy insourced or outsourced? Is an important factor in all of that as well, right? That's going to depend on how detailed your BOM management system needs to be. Right? When do you need to bring on an ERP? Right? Which ERP? Why? Right? And how do those systems talk to each other? They're all important questions, right? None are easy. There are good solutions out there.
Thank you so much, Hein, for sharing your all this experience that you've been acquired. It's amazing to be able to listen to you on all of that, and I'm sure you have a lot of founders that will appreciate those insights. Any last words before we close this webinar?
No, really what it comes down to is I wish all of you the most of luck, right? Keep things simple, keep in lockstep, understand what everybody needs to be able to do around the company. That way we can help, right? And in quality, we have a tremendous amount of knowledge and understanding of the product that can really help the commercial people, right? And having been in organizations where I sat right next to the business development people, the people that work with the data room and the investors, right, has been really an eye-opening experience. And being able to say, hey, wait a minute, you don't have to write all of that. I already have it, right? Or if I reconfigure my layout of my documents in this way, then I can just give you this, right? It's easy, no problem. And that makes a big difference, right? So work as a team, right? Across all functions, right? And that way we can protect value, right? And I, as a quality professional, can add enormous value to the organization. So why not?
Yeah, totally agree on this advice. Thank you, Hein.